Revolution and Counter-Revolution, or Germany in 1848, by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Chapter 7. The Frankfort National Assembly, February 27, 1852. It will perhaps be in the recollection of our readers that in the 6 preceding papers we followed up the revolutionary movement of Germany to the 2 great popular victories of March 13th in Vienna and March 18th in Berlin. We saw, both in Austria and Prussia, the establishment of constitutional governments and the proclamation, as leading rules for all future policy, of liberal or middle-class principles, and the only difference observable between the 2 great centers of action was this, that in Prussia the liberal bourgeoisie, in the persons of 2 wealthy merchants, Messrs. Camphausen and Hassenmann, directly seized upon the reins of power, while in Austria, where the bourgeoisie was, politically, far less educated, the liberal bureaucracy walked into office and professed to hold power in trust for them. We have further seen how the parties and classes of society that were heretofore all united in opposition to the old government got divided among themselves after the victory, or even during the struggle, and how that same liberal bourgeoisie that alone profited from the victory turned round immediately upon its allies of yesteryear, assumed a hostile attitude against every class or party of a more advanced character, and concluded an alliance with the conquered feudal and bureaucratic interests. It was, in fact, evident, even from the beginning of the revolutionary drama, that the liberal bourgeoisie could not hold its ground against the vanquished, but not destroyed, feudal and bureaucratic parties except by relying upon the assistance of the popular and more advanced parties, and that it equally required, against the torrent of these more advanced masses, the assistance of the feudal nobility and of the bureaucracy. Thus, it was clear enough that the bourgeoisie in Austria and Prussia did not possess sufficient strength to maintain their power and to adopt the institutions of the country to their own wants and ideas. The liberal bourgeois ministry was only a halting place from which, according to the turn circumstances might take, the country would either have to go on to the more advanced stage of Unitarian republicanism or to relapse into the old clerical, feudal, and bureaucratic regime. At all events, the real, decisive struggle was yet to come. The events of March had only engaged the combat. Austria and Prussia being the 2 ruling states of Germany, every decisive revolutionary victory in Vienna or Berlin would have been decisive for all Germany. And as far as they went, the events of March 1848 in those 2 cities decided the turn of German affairs. It would, then, be superfluous to recur to the movements that occurred in the minor states, and we might indeed confine ourselves to the consideration of Austrian and Prussian affairs exclusively, if the existence of these minor states had not given rise to a body which was, by its very existence, a most striking proof of the abnormal situation of Germany and of the incompleteness of the late revolution. A body so abnormal, so ludicrous by its very position, and yet so full of its own importance, that history will, most likely, never afford a pendant to it. This body was the so-called German National Assembly at Frankfort on Main. After the popular victories of Vienna and Berlin, it was a matter of course that there should be a representative assembly for all Germany. This body was consequently elected and met at Frankfort by the side of the old federative Diet. The German National Assembly was expected by the people to settle every matter in dispute and to act as the highest legislative authority for the whole of the German Confederation. But at the same time, the Diet which had convoked it had in no way fixed its attributions. No one knew whether its decrees were to have the force of law, or whether they were to be subject to the sanction of the Diet, or of the individual governments. In this perplexity, if the Assembly had been possessed of the least energy, it would have immediately dissolved and sent home the Diet, that which no corporate body was more unpopular in Germany, and replaced it by a federal government chosen from among its own members. It would have declared itself the only legal expression of the sovereign will of the German people, and thus have attached legal validity to every one of its decrees. It would, above all, have secured to itself an organized and armed force in the country sufficient to put down any opposition on the parts of the governments. And all this was easy, very easy, at that early period of the Revolution. But that would have been expecting a great deal too much from an assembly composed in its majority of liberal attorneys and doctrinaire professors, an assembly which, while it pretended to embody the very essence of German intellect and science, was in reality nothing but a stage where old and worn-out political characters exhibited their involuntary ludicrousness and their impotence of thought, as well as action, before the eyes of all Germany. This assembly of old women was, from the very first day of its existence, more frightened of the least popular movement than of all the reactionary plots of all the German governments put together. It deliberated under the eyes of the Diet, nay, it almost craved the Diet's sanction to its decrees, for its first resolutions had to be promulgated by that odious body. Instead of asserting its own sovereignty, it studiously avoided the discussion of any such dangerous question. Instead of surrounding itself by a popular force, it passed to the order of the day over all the violent encroachments of the governments. Mayence, under its very eyes, was placed in a state of siege, and the people there disarmed, and the National Assembly did not stir. Later on, it elected Archduke John of Austria regent of Germany, and declared that all its resolutions were to have the force of law. But then Archduke John was only instituted in his new dignity after the consent of all the governments had been obtained, and he was instituted not by the Assembly, but by the Diet, and as to the legal force of the decrees of the Assembly, that point was never recognized by the larger governments, nor enforced by the Assembly itself. It therefore remained in suspense. Thus we had the strange spectacle of an assembly pretending to be the only legal representative of a great and sovereign nation, and yet never possessing either the will or the force to make its claims recognized. The debates of this body, without any practical result, were not even of any theoretical value, reproducing, as they did, nothing but the most hackneyed commonplace themes of superannuated philosophical and juridical schools. Every sentence that was said, or rather stammered forth, in that assembly having been printed 1,000 times over, and 1,000 times better, long before. Thus the pretended new central authority of Germany left everything as it had found it. So far from realizing the long-demanded unity of Germany, it did not dispossess the most insignificant of the princes who ruled her. It did not draw closer the bonds of union between her separated provinces. It never moved a single step to break down the custom house barriers that separated Hanover from Prussia and Prussia from Austria. It did not even make the slightest attempt to remove the obnoxious dues that everywhere obstruct river navigation in Prussia. But the less this assembly did, the more it blustered. It created a German fleet, upon paper. It annexed Poland and Schleswig. It allowed German Austria to carry on war against Italy, and yet prohibited the Italians from following up the Austrians into their safe retreat in Germany. It gave 3 cheers and 1 cheer more for the French Republic, and it received Hungarian embassies, which certainly went home with far more confused ideas about Germany than they had come with. This assembly had been, in the beginning of the Revolution, the bugbear of all German governments. They had counted upon a very dictatorial and revolutionary action on its part, on account of the very want of definiteness in which it had been found necessary to leave its competency. These governments, therefore, got up a most comprehensive system of intrigues in order to weaken the influence of this dreaded body, and they proved to have more luck than wits, for this assembly did the work of the governments better than they themselves could have done. The chief feature among these intrigues was the convocation of local legislative assemblies, and in consequence, not only the lesser states convoked their legislatures, but Prussia and Austria also called constituent assemblies. In these, as in the Frankfurt House of Representatives, the liberal middle class, or its allies, liberal lawyers and bureaucrats, had the majority, and the turn affairs took in each of them was nearly the same. The only difference is this, that the German National Assembly was the parliament of an imaginary country, as it had declined the task of forming what nevertheless was its own first condition of existence, viz., a united Germany, that it discussed the imaginary and never to be carried out measures of an imaginary government of its own creation, and that it passed imaginary resolutions for which nobody cared. While in Austria and Prussia the constituent bodies were at least real parliaments, upsetting and creating real ministries, and forcing, for a time at least, the resolution upon the princes with whom they had to contend. They, too, were cowardly and lacked enlarged views of revolutionary resolutions. They, too, betrayed the people and restored power to the hands of the feudal, bureaucratic, and military despotism. But then they were at least obliged to discuss practical questions of immediate interest and to live upon earth with other people, while the Frankfurt humbugs were never happier than when they could roam in the airy realms of dream. Thus the proceedings of the Berlin and Vienna constituents form an important part of German revolutionary history, while the lubrications of the Frankfurt collective tomfoolery merely interest the collector of literary and antiquarian curiosities. The people of Germany, deeply feeling the necessity of doing away with the obnoxious territorial division that scattered and annihilated the collective force of the nation, for some time expected to find, in the Frankfurt National Assembly at least, the beginning of a new era. But the childish conduct of that set of wiseacres soon disenchanted this national enthusiasm. The disgraceful proceedings occasioned by the Armistice of Malmö, September 1848, made the popular indignation burst out against a body which, it had been hoped, would give the nation a fair field for action, and which instead, carried away by unequaled cowardice, only restored to their former solidity the foundations upon which the present counter-revolutionary system is built. London, January 1852.